A monarch whose body decayed while he still drew breath, flesh that rotted, wounds that festered, and a stench so overwhelming that men and women of his court gagged before him. A king who turned marriage into a form of psychological execution, and whose very presence transformed the Tower of London into the most feared address in England. This was Henry VIII, not the jolly, red-bearded king of schoolbook portraits, but a living nightmare dressed in ermine and crown. Most of us think we know him already. The king with 6 wives. The tyrant who broke with Rome. The larger-than-life monarch whose face still hangs on tapestries, coins, and museum walls. Yet behind that carefully painted mask lies a truth far more grotesque and terrifying. The reality of Henry VIII is a horror so twisted that even seasoned historians, for centuries, have tried to soften its edges. They speak of his politics, his reforms, his legacy, but rarely do they dwell on the man's descent into a monstrous parody of kingship. Because the story of Henry VIII is not merely about one ruler. It is about how absolute power corrodes a human being until nothing but fear, cruelty, and corruption remain. It is about a body that became a battleground of disease and excess, and a mind that slipped from reason into paranoia so profound that entire families perished under its shadow. The young Henry was once everything a king was expected to be: tall, athletic, handsome, a gifted musician, a scholar who spoke multiple languages. He had been described as the handsomest man in the world when he first took the throne in 1509. Standing over 6 feet tall in an age when most men were far shorter. His presence was commanding, his charisma undeniable. Foreign ambassadors marveled at his vigor, comparing him to the very image of a Renaissance prince. In those early years, it seemed England had been blessed with a ruler who embodied youth, strength, and hope. But by the end of his life, that same man had transformed into something unrecognizable, a swollen, immobile tyrant whose legs oozed pus, whose moods shifted like storms, and whose appetite consumed not only entire banquet tables but the very future of his kingdom. His courtiers, once eager to bask in his presence, came to dread the royal summons, for it meant enduring not just the reek of his body but the terror of his whims. The paradox of Henry VIII, the adored young prince who rotted into a monster, is the story you are about to hear. It is not for the faint of heart. The horrors of his reign are not confined to wars or policies. They are etched into the very lives of those closest to him. Wives and daughters who became pawns in his desperate need for power. Servants whose daily duty was to clean the fragments of their king's decaying flesh from palace floors. Nobles who trembled knowing loyalty could not protect them from a paranoid ruler's suspicions. What makes this tale even more unsettling is how easily it has been obscured. Centuries of romanticized portrayals, paintings that glorify his youth, television dramas that sanitize his violence, have disguised the true nightmare of Henry's later years. We see the legend, the king who defied the Pope, the founder of the Church of England, the father of Elizabeth I, but we forget the stench, the cruelty, the psychological terror. By the time Henry reached his final decade, he had become a spectacle of living horror. His body swelled to grotesque proportions, his legs riddled with ulcers that refused to heal. He was carried about in mechanical contraptions, leaving behind trails of rot. Even in a world accustomed to plague, filth, and deformity, Henry's presence was enough to make hardened courtiers blanch. Imagine the fear of being summoned to dine with a man whose body was literally falling apart, yet whose word could send you to the scaffold. And yet, it was not only his body that betrayed him. His mind, warped by injury and illness, turned ever more erratic. The same king who once composed love songs and poetry grew to delight in cruelty. He wielded fear like a weapon sharper than any sword. His paranoia spawned a surveillance state. His suspicions condemned innocents, and his cruelty made his queens prisoners of psychological torment before he erased them with the executioner's blade. To understand Henry VIII is to understand how absolute power transforms not only a kingdom but the very soul of the one who wields it. He became a warning written in flesh and blood, a man whose crown could not shield him from the corruption of his own body and mind. And in the end, his death, grotesque and humiliating, mirrored his life, a spectacle of horror that scarred all who witnessed it. But how did this transformation begin? How did the Golden Prince of Europe become the monster who rotted alive before his court? The answer lies in a single catastrophic event. A moment when destiny turned. When Henry's life was knocked from its path and sent spiraling toward madness. It began in the year 1536. With the thunder of hooves and the clash of lances. It was January 1536. At Greenwich Palace. When the course of England's fate shifted forever. The day began as many did in Henry's reign, with sport, spectacle, and the thunder of jousting tournaments. For a king who prided himself on strength and martial prowess, these displays were not mere entertainment but a declaration of his vitality, his superiority, his place as the very embodiment of knightly ideals. Henry VIII had long considered himself a warrior. He was an expert in archery, hunting, wrestling, and above all, jousting. The brutal sport of mounted knights shattering lances upon one another with the force of charging horses. To watch the king compete was to watch the kingdom itself, its future and virility embodied in his massive, commanding frame. On that January day, Henry rode into the lists clad in full armor, dazzling his court with the image of a monarch as knight-errant. But what followed would turn that brilliant pageantry into a nightmare that haunted him until his death. As the lances lowered and the horses thundered forward, Henry's opponent struck with perfect accuracy. The blow hurled the king from his mount, sending him crashing to the ground with such violence that his armored body struck like a fallen statue of bronze. Accounts tell us that he lay motionless, unbreathing, for 2 hours. For those gathered at the tiltyard, it seemed England had lost its king in an instant. The panic in the court was unimaginable. Here was a monarch without an heir, lying unconscious in the dirt, physicians powerless, courtiers in shock. To live in Tudor England was to know death at every turn, plague, childbirth, disease. But to lose the king so suddenly would have plunged the realm into chaos. And yet, miraculously, Henry stirred. He drew breath once more. The king had survived, but he was no longer the same man. Modern physicians studying the accounts believe Henry suffered a traumatic brain injury that day. The kind we now know can alter personality forever. To his contemporaries, however, what they witnessed was stranger, darker. The Henry who rose from that fall was not the Henry who had entered the lists. His temper, once fiery but controlled, became unpredictable, violent, and explosive. His charm gave way to suspicion. The man who had been a cultured Renaissance prince began to slip into paranoia and cruelty. But it was not only his mind that bore the scars. The accident left Henry with grievous leg injuries, wounds that refused to heal, festering and reopening with every attempt at recovery. In an age when medical knowledge was limited to herbal poultices, cauterization, and prayer, these injuries marked the beginning of his long physical decline. They would soon rot into ulcers that poured pus and blood, tormenting him with agony and fouling the very air around him. This was the pivot of Henry's reign, the moment when the young, athletic monarch who had once been hailed as the jewel of Europe began his descent into horror. For the court, it was as if they had gained back their king only to discover he had returned changed. Darker, monstrous. For Henry himself, it was perhaps worse. To awaken from the edge of death knowing his body had betrayed him. His strength had been shattered, and his once glorious vigor was gone. And perhaps it is here, in this moment of violent transformation, that Henry's later cruelty found its roots. A man who had once delighted in poetry and music began to taste bitterness. A king who had once sought the approval of his subjects began to demand their obedience through terror. For in that fall, he had glimpsed mortality, and it seems he decided that if he could not defeat death, he would at least make all others bow before his suffering. The jousting lists at Greenwich became not a place of triumph, but the silent grave of Henry's youth. The Renaissance prince had died there in the dirt, and in his place had risen a tyrant, a man who would rot alive while clutching his crown ever tighter. After the crash at Greenwich, Henry VIII's body never fully recovered. His legs, once the proud pillars that carried him into jousts and hunts, turned against him. The wounds inflicted during that tournament became more than injuries, they became open gates to rot, agony, and humiliation. From the mid-1530s until his death, the king was plagued by ulcers that refused to heal. No matter how many physicians tried their craft, these were not minor sores, but cavernous wounds that oozed pus and blood, sometimes bursting with such force that attendants recoiled. In the Tudor court, people were no strangers to disease. They lived amid plagues, rotting teeth, infected childbirths, and the constant presence of death. Yet even they recoiled from their monarch's stench. Contemporary accounts speak of courtiers gagging as they entered his chambers, of servants holding perfumed cloths to their noses while tending to him. Some vomited outright. The odor of Henry's infected flesh was said to drift across rooms, an invisible warning of the king's approach. His physicians were supposed to be men of duty and loyalty, yet even they made excuses to avoid examining him. Imagine the terror of standing before a man who could order your execution for negligence, and yet feeling such revulsion at his condition that you sought any reason to delay your visit. Refusing to treat the king could mean death, but to treat him was to confront the monstrous reality of his decaying body. Medicine in the 16th century offered little comfort. Treatments were as brutal as the disease itself. Poultices of herbs pressed into wounds, cauterization with red-hot irons to burn away rot, or the application of leeches and maggots in desperate attempts to cleanse the flesh. Physicians probed the ulcers, draining pus while Henry screamed in agony, his face red with rage and pain. And yet the ulcers always returned, worse than before. Today, historians suspect diabetes worsened the infections, preventing healing, while obesity put crushing weight on his legs. But to Henry's contemporaries, it seemed as though the king was cursed, his very flesh rebelling against him. The irony was striking. In his youth, Henry had been celebrated as one of the most athletic monarchs in Europe. He could ride, run, hunt, and joust with unmatched vigor. Now, in middle age, he was a prisoner of his own legs, swollen, foul, and agonizing. His once proud frame carried the weight of his downfall. Servants whispered of divine punishment, though never within earshot of the king himself. And here lies the cruelest twist. Henry's pain made him crueler still. The constant agony fed his paranoia, sharpened his temper, and deepened his suspicion of everyone around him. Every throb in his legs was another reminder that the Golden Prince was gone, replaced by a man who could not escape his own suffering. As the ulcers grew worse, Henry's movements slowed. His once graceful presence gave way to lumbering steps. Each one labored, each one a battle against pain. By the 1540s, he required special contraptions, chairs mounted on wheels, pulleys, and teams of attendants, to move him from chamber to chamber. The man who had once embodied power now relied on others to drag him across his own palaces. And as they did, pieces of him, flesh, pus, foul bandages, sometimes fell to the floor, leaving behind a trail of decay. Imagine being the servant whose task it was to follow with cloths and buckets, cleaning fragments of your king from the ground. Imagine the dread each morning, knowing you might face not only the stench of rotting flesh but also the wrath of a monarch whose temper had grown as foul as his wounds. Many attendants abandoned their posts despite the honor of royal service, preferring poverty or disgrace to the nightmare of tending Henry's body. The ulcers were more than medical afflictions. They were symbols. They embodied the corruption of Henry's reign, the rot that spread from his own body into the kingdom itself. His court, once a place of splendor and brilliance, became a chamber of sickness and fear. Every decision, every command, came from a man whose body betrayed him daily, and whose soul grew darker with each pulse of pain. Thus, the king's legs, festering, foul, and feared, became emblems of a reign unraveling. They were not just wounds, they were a prophecy, a grotesque reminder that even the most powerful crown could not shield its wearer from decay. As the ulcers spread and pain became Henry's constant companion, another transformation overtook him. His body began to swell beyond recognition. The once handsome, athletic prince, admired by foreign ambassadors and adored by his subjects, now became a bloated figure trapped in his own flesh. By his final years, Henry VIII weighed close to 400 pounds. His waistline expanded to a staggering 54 inches, larger than the height of many of his subjects. His face, once chiseled and noble, grew so swollen that his eyes were reduced to narrow slits peering out of a balloon of flesh. His neck vanished entirely beneath folds of fat, until his head seemed to rest directly on his shoulders like a grotesque mask. This was not the natural plumpness of middle age. It was monstrous. His body became a prison that confined him and horrified those forced to look upon it. He could no longer mount a horse, no longer dance, no longer perform the ceremonies of kingship with dignity. His legendary feasts only worsened his condition, creating a vicious cycle of indulgence, pain, and despair. In an age when the poor starved from bad harvests, the king devoured enough food for a village, his excess literally consuming him from within. Mobility became one of his greatest humiliations. The king who had once charged into battle on horseback now needed elaborate contraptions to move through his palaces. Craftsmen constructed chairs with wheels and pulleys capable of bearing his massive bulk. Teams of servants strained to lift or push him across rooms. Special ramps were built so that Henry could be carried up and down staircases. Where once his presence had been announced with trumpets and grandeur, now it was heralded by the creak of wooden wheels and the groans of exhausted attendants. And still, the decay followed him, as his body shifted in these devices. Infected flesh would sometimes tear loose from his legs, dropping onto the palace floors. The image is almost too grotesque to comprehend. The King of England, supreme head of the church, leaving behind scraps of his own body in the corridors of Whitehall and Hampton Court. Behind him shuffled servants with buckets, rags, and clenched jaws, cleaning away the fragments of their monarch as if erasing evidence of his corruption. The psychological toll of this spectacle was immense. Courtiers, who had once competed for the honor of being near the king, began to dread any summons to his chamber. To stand before him was to endure the stench, the sight, and the suffocating tension of a ruler whose moods could explode without warning. Once, his presence inspired awe. Now, it inspired nausea and fear. But Henry refused to hide himself away. Unlike some rulers who withdrew from public life when their bodies failed them, Henry insisted on being seen. He clung to displays of majesty, forcing his courtiers to bow before his monstrous frame, demanding respect even as his flesh betrayed him. He ordered clothes cut larger and larger, rich fabrics stretched to cover his bulk, jewels glittering across his swollen chest. These displays of wealth and grandeur were attempts to conceal the truth, but the truth could not be hidden. Everyone knew their king was rotting alive. And perhaps here lies the most chilling image of all. The king's own body became a metaphor for his reign. Once vibrant, promising, and powerful, now bloated, festering, and corrupt, the ulcers on his legs were mirrored in the rot of his court. His obesity was echoed in the excesses of his rule. His immobility symbolized a kingdom weighed down by fear and tyranny. The body of Henry VIII was not just failing, it was reflecting the state of England under his rule. By this point, Henry was no longer the Renaissance prince of Europe. He was a tyrant trapped inside a grotesque shell. A man whose every step was agony, whose every glance could mean death, and whose very presence had become a living nightmare for all who served him. And yet, the worst was still to come, for Henry's physical decay was only the beginning. His mind, scarred by injury and consumed by pain, was about to unleash horrors far darker than the stench of his wounds. To serve a king was once the highest honor in England. It meant proximity to power, influence at court, and the possibility of wealth or favor. But by the later years of Henry VIII's reign, that honor had curdled into a waking nightmare. For those who lived in his palaces, the daily routine was marked not by splendor, but by the horror of tending to a monarch whose body was collapsing in on itself. Everywhere Henry went, reminders of his decay followed. His leg ulcers, deep and foul, oozed constantly, bandages soaked through in hours, dripping onto clothing, floors, even the carpets of the royal chambers. The smell, an unbearable mixture of rotting meat and festering infection, clung to everything he touched. Attendants tasked with changing his dressings endured scenes that would have broken even seasoned soldiers, bursts of pus under pressure, flesh sloughing away in their hands, the king himself roaring in agony or rage. When Henry was moved, the horror became public. His wheeled chairs left not just the sound of creaking wood and straining servants, but sometimes trails of infection, pieces of dead tissue, soaked bandages that slipped free, or drops of foul liquid marked his path. Behind him, servants followed like a morbid procession, buckets and cloths in hand, wiping up the remains of their sovereign. Imagine the psychological toll of such a duty, to clean the king's own flesh from the ground. Knowing that failure, or even a grimace of disgust, could mean the scaffold. These men and women lived in constant tension, balancing revulsion with fear. One wrong move, one sign of disrespect or hesitation, and Henry's paranoid fury could be unleashed. And yet, many reached their breaking point. Records suggest that numerous attendants resigned their posts despite the prestige of serving the king. For them, even poverty was preferable to the trauma of living in the shadow of Henry's decay. But escape was not so simple. For courtiers, nobles, and ambassadors, proximity to the king was unavoidable. Audience with Henry was no longer a privilege to be sought after, but a duty to be endured. Men approached his chamber with perfumed cloths clutched tightly to their faces. Some described their stomachs turning, bile rising in their throats. There are even accounts of men vomiting upon entering the king's presence. Yet all were required to bow, to smile, to treat their monarch with reverence, as though the man before them was still the glorious prince of earlier years. This contradiction, of reverence amid revulsion, created an atmosphere of psychological torment at court. Everyone lived in a dual reality, the official lie that the king was majestic, and the undeniable truth that he was physically monstrous. To speak of the latter was treason, to deny it was impossible. Thus, a dangerous theater unfolded daily, where every word, every gesture, was calculated for survival. Henry himself seemed aware of this tension, and he weaponized it. He forced his court to witness his feasts, his ceremonies, his very presence, daring them to flinch. His decaying body became part of his tyranny. Those who served him were not merely bound by loyalty, they were bound by fear of what they saw, smelled, and endured. To stand in Henry's presence was to experience power not as majesty, but as terror. The trauma radiated outward. Families of servants whispered of nightmares, of kin returning home pale and shaken, haunted by the grotesque duties of the day. Courtiers wrote in letters, careful never to be too explicit, that life at court had grown unbearable, suffocating, a theater of death and fear. Thus, the man who had once embodied glory had transformed into a walking horror show. His body, failing and foul, was no longer merely a private misery. It was a weapon of control, a force that bent those around him into silence and dread. To serve Henry VIII in his final years was not to bask in royal light, but to endure the suffocating darkness of a monarch who carried his own corruption wherever he went. And yet, as horrifying as the physical spectacle was, it was only the outward sign of something far worse. For within Henry's mind, the real nightmare was taking shape, a descent into paranoia, violence, and cruelty that would make his festering flesh seem almost trivial in comparison. The Henry who emerged after the accident of 1536 was no longer the Golden Prince of Europe. What had once been a mind capable of charm, music, and diplomacy turned darker with each passing year. The physical wounds on his legs were visible to all, but the wound to his mind was something far more insidious and far more dangerous. Before the fall, Henry had shown flashes of temper. Yes, but he was also known for generosity, for elaborate entertainments, for the warmth that could win over even foreign ambassadors. After the fall, those qualities withered. In their place grew paranoia so thick it poisoned every relationship, cruelty so sharp it cut through even family ties, and a hunger for control that devoured anyone who dared stand in his way. Modern medicine would call it traumatic brain injury, perhaps compounded by what we now suspect to have been diabetes and Cushing's syndrome. To his contemporaries, however, it seemed as though the king had been touched by some darker hand. He was more suspicious, more erratic, more violent. A glance could become an accusation, a word, a death sentence. His court began to live in terror not only of what Henry might decide, but of how he might feel on any given morning. Pain fed his paranoia. The ulcers throbbed constantly, infections spreading until even lying in bed became torture. He turned that torment outward, lashing not just at enemies but at those who loved him most. His wives felt the full brunt of it, their lives twisted into games of humiliation, control, and destruction. Courtiers who had once been loyal friends were suddenly branded traitors, often on the flimsiest of evidence, or on no evidence at all. The change was so stark that even those closest to him could not deny it. In his youth, Henry had written tender love letters to Catherine of Aragon and composed music in her honor. By the 1540s, the same man could order a wife's execution and watch her die without a flicker of regret. What kind of mind makes such a transformation? One battered by pain, consumed by fear of betrayal, and emboldened by the knowledge that no one dared resist him. And yet, Henry never admitted weakness. The irony of his later years was that he claimed divine right with even greater fervor the more his body and mind betrayed him. He insisted that God had chosen him uniquely, that his word was law not only on earth but in heaven. This insistence, mixed with paranoia, created a volatile brew, a man who saw every challenge, every hesitation, as not only treason but heresy against God himself. In this way, Henry's decline became more than personal, it became political. His mood swings reshaped alliances. His suspicion destroyed noble families that had served the crown for centuries. His cruelty carved scars into the very heart of England, scars that would bleed long after his death. But perhaps the most chilling truth was this: Henry had begun to take pleasure in the suffering he caused. Those who watched him closely saw it in his eyes, in the faint curl of his lips as an enemy was led to the block, in the satisfaction with which he tore down wives, friends, and counselors alike. Pain had not only changed him, it had made cruelty into his only reliable source of relief. Thus, the transformation was complete. The Renaissance prince had become a predator. His crown, once a symbol of youthful glory, was now the mask of a tyrant whose own agony became fuel for terror. And those closest to him, his wives above all, would soon feel that terror in ways that words can scarcely describe. If Henry's body was decaying, his marriages revealed the rot of his soul. No woman bore the weight of his cruelty longer than Catherine of Aragon. His first queen, the wife who had stood beside him for nearly a quarter of a century. Their union had once been strong. Catherine, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, had brought prestige, alliance, and dignity to England. She endured miscarriages, stillbirths, and the loss of children. Yet she remained steadfast, giving Henry a daughter, Mary, who would one day rule in her own right. But Henry demanded more. He wanted a son, a living heir, a prince to secure the Tudor dynasty. When Catherine could no longer give him one, Henry turned their marriage into a battlefield of humiliation. Instead of seeking quiet annulment or compromise, he struck at her identity itself. He declared that their 24 years of marriage had been nothing but sin, that she had never been his true wife. In an instant, the Queen of England was branded a fraud. This was not only a political maneuver, it was psychological warfare. To Catherine, a devout Catholic who believed marriage was sacred before God, Henry's claim was like tearing her very soul in two. Imagine being told that the love you had given, the vows you had spoken, the child you had borne, all of it was null, void, an offense against heaven. Henry made her live under this shadow, day after day, stripping her of dignity piece by piece. He isolated her from court, from friends, even from her daughter Mary. Catherine was forbidden to see the child she had raised, a weapon more cruel than any sword. To the Queen, Mary was not just her daughter but her legacy, her proof that her marriage had meaning. To be cut off from her was to bleed slowly in silence. Catherine begged, pleaded, wrote letters filled with pain. But Henry remained unmoved. His will was law, and her suffering was his tool. At times he twisted the knife with false kindness. Some days he would send her gifts, soft words, empty gestures of affection. The next day he would threaten her with charges of treason. This oscillation between warmth and cruelty drove her into a state of constant dread, never knowing whether she faced reconciliation or ruin. It was the kind of torment that breaks the mind, unrelenting uncertainty. The slow erosion of hope. Catherine's body began to fail under the pressure. Chronic stomach pains racked her, an illness many historians suspect was stress-induced. Though some whisper of poison, she grew weaker, thinner, more fragile, yet she never renounced her title, never agreed to Henry's demands that she call herself only Princess Dowager. In her heart, she remained queen. That defiance may have cost her dearly. In 1536, as Henry celebrated his new life with Anne Boleyn, Catherine lay dying in isolation. She was surrounded not by her husband, not by her daughter, but only by a handful of loyal servants who refused to abandon her. Even at the end, she reached out to Henry in letters, urging him to show mercy to their child, professing her love despite all he had done. He never came, he never answered. When she died, Henry dressed in yellow, the color of joy, parading himself in public as though freed from a burden. He even placed Mary under further restrictions, denying her the comfort of mourning her mother, Catherine of Aragon, the woman who had crossed seas to become his bride, who had borne his losses with strength, who had fought for her daughter's rights with unyielding spirit, was discarded, humiliated, erased. Her grave lay far from the splendor of kings, a simple tomb in Peterborough Cathedral. And yet, in her suffering, Catherine revealed something Henry could never conceal. While he rotted in body and spirit, she clung to dignity until her last breath. In the silent halls where she died, the contrast was stark. One queen broken but unbowed, and one king who had already begun his descent into monstrous tyranny. If Catherine of Aragon endured the slow torment of humiliation, Anne Boleyn suffered something far more theatrical. Henry's second queen was not merely discarded, she was destroyed through an elaborate performance of cruelty, engineered to maximize her suffering before death. Anne had once been Henry's obsession. He had pursued her for nearly 7 years, breaking from the Pope himself to make her queen. For her, he tore England from Rome, upended centuries of religious order, and plunged the nation into turmoil. Yet this passion, once fierce and consuming, soon curdled into resentment when she, too, failed to give him the son he demanded. Anne bore him only a daughter, Elizabeth, and a series of miscarriages. For Henry, who now saw himself as cursed by God, this was reason enough to erase her. But Henry did not simply order her death. That would have been too swift, too merciful. Instead, he staged a spectacle. He began by weaving a net of accusations, whispers of adultery, charges of witchcraft, even claims of incest. The first to be seized was her court musician, Mark Smeaton, who under torture confessed to being her lover. But one man's confession was not enough. Henry demanded more. Soon, 4 others were accused, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. The cruelty of this scheme was deliberate. Imagine Anne, imprisoned in the Tower of London, hearing the names of friends, allies, even her own blood being dragged into her downfall. Each arrest was a knife turned deeper. And Henry was not finished. He forced Anne to witness the executions. One by one, the men condemned for their supposed affairs with her were beheaded. Her brother's head, lifted high for the crowd, was the most unbearable of all. It was a message written in blood. You will die knowing you brought ruin upon those you loved. Even the manner of Anne's execution was twisted into psychological torture. Adultery was traditionally punished by burning at the stake. Henry announced this fate for her, then rescinded it, mercifully, granting her a swifter beheading. But the delay dragged out her dread. He even sent for a specialist executioner from France, famed for his clean sword strokes. While the Frenchman traveled to England, Anne waited in the tower, suspended between hope and despair. Perhaps she thought Henry might relent. Perhaps she prayed for divine intervention. Instead, she was forced to endure days of anticipation. Each sunrise a reminder that death drew nearer. Her final hours were marked by eerie contradictions. Witnesses described her as at times hysterical, laughing uncontrollably, and at other times calm, praying for hours in a strange serenity. It was as though her mind, crushed beneath the weight of terror, teetered between madness and acceptance. On May 19, 1536, she mounted the scaffold dressed in gray damask, her dark eyes fixed on the crowd. Her speech, carefully delivered, asked for no vengeance, no protest of innocence. She spoke only loyalty to the king who had orchestrated her ruin, knowing that any other words could condemn her daughter Elizabeth to greater danger. The French executioner, brought to ensure a merciful death, distracted her with a feint of his sword, then struck swiftly. Her head fell, and with it the brief, tumultuous reign of Anne Boleyn. Yet Henry's cruelty did not end there. He ensured her memory was stained, her name whispered with scandal, her image painted as a seductress who bewitched a king and betrayed him. Even her daughter Elizabeth grew up in the shadow of this stigma. But history would have the last word. For though Anne's body was destroyed, her bloodline endured. That same daughter, Elizabeth I, would one day ascend the throne and rule with a brilliance that eclipsed her father's decaying legacy. In the end, Henry's attempt to erase Anne became the foundation of her triumph. Yet for Anne herself, the orchestrated downfall was a masterpiece of psychological cruelty, the clearest glimpse into how far Henry VIII had fallen from prince to monster. If Anne Boleyn's fall was a carefully staged tragedy, Catherine Howard's was a grotesque spectacle of exploitation. She was scarcely more than a girl, barely 19, when Henry, swollen with age, disease, and paranoia, claimed her as his fifth wife. She was vivacious, playful, and radiant with youth, everything Henry no longer possessed but desperately craved. To his court, the image was almost surreal, a decaying king in his late 40s. His legs ulcerated and oozing, beside a bride whose laughter still belonged to adolescence. Imagine Catherine's terror on her wedding night. The man she was forced to share a bed with was no gallant prince, no noble knight, but a monstrous figure whose flesh reeked of infection, whose bulk suffocated the chamber, and whose temper could turn from affection to fury without warning. To the world, she was queen. In truth, she was a prisoner in the most intimate cage of all, her marriage bed. Henry at first adored her. He called her his rose without a thorn, showered her with jewels, paraded her youth as though it restored his own virility. But adoration from Henry VIII was always conditional. When whispers reached him that Catherine had not been a virgin upon their marriage, his pride curdled into fury. For Henry, this was not a private matter of honor, it was treason. He enacted one of the most chilling laws of his reign. It became high treason for anyone to marry the king without confessing their complete sexual history. Think of the absurdity, the arrogance, an entire legal code twisted to soothe one man's wounded vanity. In Henry's eyes, Catherine's past had not merely betrayed him personally, it had betrayed the crown, the church, and God himself. What followed was pure psychological torment. Catherine was dragged to the Tower of London, where she remained imprisoned for months before her execution. In that limbo of stone walls and iron bars, Henry subjected her to a cruel game of hope and despair. Some days she received messages hinting that if she confessed and begged forgiveness, she might be spared. Other days she was reminded in graphic detail of the executioner's axe waiting for her. It was a torment designed to crush the mind as surely as the body. Guards recorded her descent into hysteria. She screamed through the night, her cries echoing across the tower's ancient stones. At times she lapsed into silence so complete that attendants feared she had gone mad. Witnesses swore she aged years in those few months, her youthful glow replaced by the gaunt face of despair. She had become a ghost of herself before death ever touched her. On the day of her execution in February 1542, Catherine faced the scaffold with trembling composure. She spoke briefly, asking mercy of God and forgiveness of those she had wronged. Then, in a moment both heartbreaking and unforgettable, she laid her head upon the block and whispered, "I'd die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." Whether the words were truly spoken or embroidered by chroniclers, they capture the essence of Catherine's tragedy. A girl trapped by a king's monstrous hunger, longing for the freedom of a love denied her. The axe fell, and her young life ended before it had even truly begun. For Henry, it was another chapter in the theater of his cruelty, a queen destroyed not because she betrayed him in truth, but because she reminded him of what he could never be again: young, vigorous, and loved. Catherine Howard's death stands as one of the most haunting symbols of Henry's descent. She was not a rival, not a threat, but a child forced into the arms of a decaying tyrant and punished for the crime of being human. Her screams still seem to echo through the tower, a reminder that under Henry VIII, love itself could become a death sentence. Among Henry VIII's 6 wives, Jane Seymour is often called the lucky one. She alone gave him the son he craved, and she alone escaped the scaffold, dying not by the king's order but from natural causes. Yet to call her lucky is to misunderstand the brutal reality of her short queenship. Jane's fate was no blessing, it was a death sentence written in childbirth. A reminder of how Henry viewed women not as partners, but as vessels for heirs. Jane entered Henry's life as the quiet antithesis of Anne Boleyn. Where Anne had been sharp-witted, ambitious, and fiery. Jane was demure, pliant, and obedient, at least in appearance. For a man grown paranoid and tyrannical, she seemed the perfect salve. A woman who would not challenge him, who would not demand. Within days of Anne's execution, Jane was betrothed to the king. Less than 2 weeks later, she was queen. Her reign was brief, scarcely 16 months. Henry doted on her in his own fashion, declaring her his true wife, the one chosen by God to give him the male heir he had long sought. And in 1537, she fulfilled that purpose. After 3 days of agonizing labor, Jane delivered a son, Edward, whose birth was celebrated with ringing bells, feasts, and proclamations across the kingdom. For Henry, it was triumph. For Jane, it was the beginning of the end. Her body, weakened by prolonged labor and the crude medical practices of the age, succumbed to infection. Within 2 weeks of Edward's birth, the Queen was dead. To the people of England, she was mourned as the mother of the long-awaited heir. To Henry, she became something stranger, a figure elevated into near sainthood, revered because she had accomplished what no other wife could. But what of Jane herself? The tragedy of her story is not only that she died young, but that her identity was consumed entirely by her role as mother. In her lifetime, she was valued chiefly for her obedience in her womb. In death, she was remembered chiefly for producing a son. Even Henry's grief, though by all accounts genuine, reveals this truth. He dressed in mourning, spoke of her as his beloved, and kept her memory alive. Yet within days, he was already considering new marriage alliances. For the king, queens were replaceable. Only the male heir endured. Perhaps the most chilling detail lies in Jane's final hours of labor. Physicians, faced with a mother and child both in peril, made a grim decision. They would prioritize the infant. There are suggestions Henry himself gave the order, save the boy at all costs. If true, it lays bare the ruthless calculus of the Tudor court. A queen's life could be measured against the promise of an heir, and she could be found expendable. Jane Seymour's legacy is often painted softly, the gentle queen, the peacemaker, the one Henry truly loved. But peel back the romantic gloss, and what remains is a portrait of disposability. Jane's greatest act, bearing a son, was also her undoing. Her body was broken to give Henry the heir he demanded, and once broken, she was gone. Henry had her buried at Windsor, and decades later, when his own grotesque body finally gave out, he chose to be interred beside her. Not Catherine of Aragon, who had stood by him for decades, not Anne Boleyn, for whom he had torn his kingdom apart, but Jane, the wife who died fulfilling her duty. In his mind, she had been perfect, but in truth, she had been sacrificed on the altar of his obsession. Jane Seymour's death reveals the cold truth of Henry's marriages. To him, a wife was not a partner but a means to an end. Love, loyalty, devotion. These words held no weight when weighed against the demand for a son. And in Jane's quiet tragedy, we see how even the so-called fortunate wife was in fact another victim of the king who consumed all around him. If Jane Seymour was remembered as the obedient wife who gave Henry his heir, Anne of Cleves became known as the wife who escaped him. Yet her survival was not luck alone. It was the result of a humiliating performance, a carefully played act of submission that allowed her to keep her head while others lost theirs. Anne was never meant to be Henry's great love. She was a political pawn, brought to England in 1540 as part of an alliance with the Protestant states of Germany. When Henry first saw her portrait, painted by the celebrated Hans Holbein, he was pleased. But portraits, as Henry discovered, could flatter. When the king met Anne in person, his disappointment was immediate and brutal. He declared her unattractive, complained of her body, even mocked her foreign manners. He told courtiers that he liked her not, a phrase that spread through the palace like wildfire. The marriage, however, had already been arranged. Duty demanded he proceed, and so he did, grudgingly. For 6 months, Anne was queen in name but never in Henry's heart. Rumors spread that he could not consummate the marriage, that he found her so unappealing he avoided her bed altogether. The humiliation was public, whispered among courtiers and chroniclers alike. The king who had once prided himself on his virility was now mocked for his failure. When Henry resolved to be rid of her, The pattern of cruelty might have suggested another scaffold, yet Anne played her role with remarkable cunning. Instead of resisting, instead of clinging to her crown, she submitted entirely. She agreed to the annulment, declaring before all that the marriage had never been valid. She accepted Henry's judgment, thanked him for his generosity, and even referred to him thereafter as her dear brother. It was an act of survival. By erasing herself as queen, she spared her life. Henry, perhaps amused by her submission, rewarded her with a generous settlement, houses, lands, and the title, the king's sister. While Catherine of Aragon had died isolated and broken, while Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard had met the axe, Anne of Cleves lived in comfort until her death, one of the few who escaped the king's wrath intact. But survival came at a cost. Anne endured humiliation on a scale almost as cruel as execution. To be declared unworthy of her husband, to have her body mocked, her marriage erased, her queenship annulled, these were scars that never healed. She lived out her life on the margins of power, a figure both honored and sidelined, remembered not for who she was, but for who she had failed to be in Henry's eyes. Her story reveals another facet of Henry's cruelty, psychological manipulation on a grand stage. He reduced a queen to nothing more than an error, a mistake to be brushed aside. Yet Anne's compliance also shows the terrifying choices women faced in his orbit. To resist was to die. To submit was to survive, but only as a shadow of oneself. In the end, Anne of Cleves' greatest victory was that she lived. Among Henry's 6 wives, hers was perhaps the quietest fate, but also the most subversive. She outlasted him, outlasted Catherine Howard, and watched as Henry's monstrous body continued to betray him. In silence, in the safety of her estates, she endured, and in that endurance, she triumphed, not as a queen, but as a survivor of the most dangerous marriage bed in England. By the time Henry VIII chose Catherine Parr as his 6th wife in 1543, he was no longer a man of passion but of suspicion, paranoia, and decay. His body was swollen, his legs ulcerated, and his temper unpredictable. Catherine, twice widowed already, was intelligent, well-read, and deeply pious. Unlike Henry's other queens, she did not enter the marriage as a naive girl or an ambitious courtier but as a mature woman who understood the dangers of power. And it was this wisdom, perhaps more than anything, that saved her life. At first, Catherine seemed to offer Henry comfort. She nursed him, soothed his rages, and acted as a companion when most others recoiled from him. She even helped reconcile him with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, showing a rare warmth in a court steeped in fear. But intelligence in Henry's presence was a dangerous thing. Catherine's strong Protestant convictions and her habit of debating theology soon placed her in grave peril. By the mid-1540s, Henry's paranoia had reached new heights. Surrounded by factions, Catholic conservatives on one side, Reformist Protestants on the other, he grew suspicious of every word spoken in his court. When Catherine spoke too boldly about matters of Scripture, his enemies whispered that she sought to undermine the king's authority. They painted her not as a dutiful wife but as a heretic. In 1546, Henry signed her death warrant. The Queen of England, the woman who had nursed his festering body and endured his rages, was to be arrested and executed. But fate, or perhaps Catherine's own quick wit, intervened. Someone loyal to her slipped her word of the plot. And instead of despair, Catherine devised a plan. The very next day, she went to Henry and threw herself at his mercy. But she did not argue theology, nor defend her beliefs. Instead, she flattered him. She told him that her debates about Scripture had never been meant to instruct him, but to learn from his superior wisdom. She insisted that she was merely a humble student before the greatest mind in Christendom. Henry, whose ego was as bloated as his body, softened. By the time guards arrived to arrest her, he dismissed them with a laugh, claiming his counsel had misunderstood her entirely. Catherine Parr had survived by turning submission into strategy, her life preserved by a carefully chosen lie. Yet even in survival, the fear was constant. Catherine lived each day knowing that Henry's favor could evaporate at the slightest provocation. She walked on eggshells, measuring every word, every gesture. To be his wife was not security, it was perpetual danger. And still, she endured. Catherine outlived Henry, the only one of his wives to do so as queen. when he finally succumbed to his rotting body in 1547. She was free at last. But the scars of those years, the knowledge that her husband had signed her death warrant with his own hand, never truly faded. Catherine Parr's story illuminates the last, most chilling truth about Henry's marriages. Even survival was a form of torment. She did not escape by love, nor by loyalty, but by submission so absolute that it demanded she erase her own voice in order to placate a monstrous king. She lived not because Henry loved her, but because she convinced him that he was incapable of being wrong. In her triumph, however fragile, Catherine Parr revealed both the danger and the power of words. For in a court where truth was deadly, flattery could be the sharpest weapon of all. If Henry's marriages revealed the cruelty of his soul, his dining table revealed the grotesque appetite that consumed his body. In his later years, food became his obsession, his solace, and his stage. What he ate, how he ate, and the rituals surrounding his meals tell us as much about his decline as the ulcers on his legs or the terror in his court. In youth, Henry had been athletic, burning thousands of calories through hunting, jousting, and sport, but after his accident, when movement grew painful and his world shrank to the confines of chairs and chambers, he turned increasingly to food. By the 1540s, he consumed more than 5,000 calories a day, double what an active soldier might require, and vastly more than his failing body could endure. Feasts stretched for hours. A single dinner might include an entire roast pig, multiple whole chickens, venison, swans, mountains of bread, and endless rivers of wine, fish dishes, sweetmeats, pies stuffed with spices, puddings drowning in sugar. His kitchens produced an almost unimaginable abundance. And abundance itself was the point. The royal kitchens at Hampton Court employed over 200 servants, laboring day and night to prepare more than 800 dishes daily for the king and his household. These meals were not simply sustenance, they were symbols of power, wealth, and excess. Yet Henry's relationship with food was not merely indulgent, it was superstitious. He believed certain meats or delicacies could transform him. Eating swan, he thought, would grant him grace. Venison would make him a better hunter. Oysters, consumed in obscene quantities, were meant to revive his waning virility. These were not meals so much as rituals, desperate attempts to reassert control over a body that betrayed him. But perhaps the most disturbing part of Henry's feasting was the performance. Meals were rarely private. Hundreds of courtiers were forced to watch their king gorge himself, their faces arranged into masks of admiration while their stomachs churned from the smell of his rotting legs. Imagine sitting in a grand hall filled with the stench of disease, pretending to delight as Henry tore meat from the bone, his lips stained with wine, his breath heavy with decay. Silence was dangerous. Averted eyes were dangerous. Everyone was compelled to act as though this gluttony was majesty itself. And then there was the paranoia. Henry feared poison as much as he craved food. Every dish that reached his table had already passed through layers of inspection. Servants tasted each bite in advance, then waited half an hour to prove it safe. Guards watched the kitchens, watching each other in turn, as though treachery lurked in the very salt. A simple supper became a military operation, with entire staffs working to ensure that not a single crumb could harm him. Meanwhile, beyond the palace gates, England starved. Harvest failures, bad weather, and rising prices left common families hungry, while the king devoured enough food to feed hundreds in a single sitting. His waste was staggering. Leftovers that could have sustained villages were thrown to dogs or left to rot. His gluttony was not only personal destruction, it was a symbol of the inequality that scarred his reign. The irony was cruel. The more Henry ate, the sicker he became. The more he suffered, the more he ate to drown the pain. It was a vicious cycle. Physicians dared not warn him, for to criticize the king's table was treason. And so, they stood by in silence, watching him eat himself deeper into decay. By his final years, meals were not simply nourishment or pleasure. They were an assertion of power, a grotesque display of dominance. To eat was to prove he was still king, still feared, still obeyed, even as his body collapsed under the weight of his indulgence. Thus, the dining table became another stage of horror. Each feast was both a celebration and a funeral march. A slow procession toward a death he could neither see nor stop. For Henry VIII, food was both his crown and his coffin. If Henry's table was a theater of excess, his palace was a fortress of fear. By the last decade of his reign, paranoia had become his constant companion, shaping not only his nights but the very architecture of his world. The king who once rode boldly into tournaments now slept surrounded by weapons and guards. He kept loaded crossbows by his bed and daggers beneath his pillows. As if the shadows themselves conspired against him, armed guards stood in his chamber through the night, their eyes fixed not on intruders but on the king's own restless sleep. Yet even this was not enough. Henry feared the very men assigned to protect him. He ordered that they be rotated constantly, lest they conspire during their long hours of watch. The guards were themselves guarded. Layers of suspicion nested one within the other until the king's bedroom resembled less a royal chamber than a prison cell. The palaces themselves mirrored his paranoia. Henry ordered secret passages to be carved into walls, hidden corridors that allowed him to flee unseen if assassins came. Peepholes were cut into panels so he could spy on courtiers, while rudimentary listening devices were placed in meeting rooms. It was as though the great halls of Hampton Court and Whitehall had been transformed into labyrinths of distrust. Spaces designed not for splendor but for surveillance. This web extended beyond stone and mortar. Henry created a network of informants that grew so tangled it became almost absurd. Spies watched courtiers. Courtiers spied on servants, and even the spies themselves were shadowed by other spies. No one knew who might be listening, who might be reporting. Every conversation, even within families, was a potential death trap. Husbands feared wives, children feared parents, and loyalty itself became dangerous, for it could be twisted into suspicion at any moment. The atmosphere was suffocating. Imagine living in a world where silence could damn you, where a careless phrase spoken in jest might echo in the ears of a paid informer, where trust was no longer possible. To be at Henry's court was to perform a constant play of obedience, masking every thought behind a smile that concealed dread. And this paranoia seeped into the smallest details of daily life. Food, already an obsession, became a matter of military precision. Every ingredient was tested, every dish guarded, every servant scrutinized. Plates were examined for poison. Spices smelled and tasted. Water verified by multiple hands before it touched the king's lips. Even the act of seasoning his meat became a ritual of suspicion. Kitchens bustled like war camps, their staff laboring under the constant fear that any slip, any mistake, might be seen as treachery. The most chilling evidence of his paranoia lay in how he viewed his own family. Even his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, were not spared. He ordered spies to watch them, convinced they might plot against him. These were children, his blood, his legacy, and yet he treated them as potential enemies. The scars of that surveillance would shape them both. Mary into a queen remembered as Bloody Mary, and Elizabeth into a ruler who learned never to trust completely. Henry's court, once a place of music, pageantry, and debate, had become a gilded prison. Nobles walked the halls like ghosts, their laughter silenced, their whispers weighed. The king who had once united his court in admiration now bound it in fear, transforming loyalty into suspicion and fellowship into betrayal. This was the true cost of Henry's paranoia. It did not only consume him, it consumed everyone around him. The court ceased to be a gathering of noble families and became instead a stage for terror. A place where every step might be your last, where every smile might conceal a dagger. Henry had turned the crown into a cage, and he alone held the key. Henry's paranoia was not a private torment. It spilled out into the kingdom, filling the Tower of London with men and women whose only crime was to exist near the king when suspicion clouded his mind. The tyrant's fear became blood, his doubt became execution, and in this reign of terror, no one was safe, friend, family, or faithful servant. In his final years, Henry ordered executions not for deeds, but for thoughts he imagined others might have. A dream could condemn a man. A whisper, a rumor, a suspicion. These were enough to summon the axe. Loyalty was meaningless, innocence no shield. To stand close to Henry was to live with a noose always tightening around your neck. One of the most chilling examples was the case of Henry Courtenay, the Marquis of Exeter. Courtenay had been loyal for years. bound by blood to the royal family itself. Yet Henry dreamed, or was told, that Courtenay plotted against him. That dream was enough. Courtenay was executed, his life cut short not by treason, but by the paranoia of a king who trusted no one. This set a precedent that poisoned the entire court. If the Marquis of Exeter could fall, who was safe? The answer was no one. Even family ties could not protect you. The king had already turned against his wives, against his daughters, against his most trusted advisers. When suspicion took hold, death followed. The Tower of London became the physical embodiment of Henry's paranoia. Its cold stone walls echoed with the footsteps of prisoners who had once dined in splendor beside the king. Nobles, musicians, scholars, soldiers, all walked through its gates knowing they would likely never walk out again. It was not only a prison, but a waiting room for death, where the accused lingered under the shadow of the axe. And executions were not private affairs. They were theater. Henry ensured the public saw the heads roll, saw the bodies fall, saw the blood stain the scaffold. Each death was a performance meant to remind England that the king's fear was law. That no one, no matter how beloved, no matter how powerful, was beyond his reach. It was a warning written in gore. The king's suspicion is your sentence. This culture of fear spread far beyond the palace gates. Nobles betrayed one another to survive. Servants whispered rumors in the hope of currying favor. Families turned inward, silencing their own children lest an innocent word be twisted into evidence of treason. England became a nation of watchers. Each eye turned warily upon the other. Each mouth closed in self-preservation. Henry's paranoia was contagious. His court became infected with it. And soon his kingdom too. Trust rotted as surely as the king's legs. The natural bonds of loyalty and kinship eroded under the constant threat of betrayal. People no longer asked, "Am I safe?" They asked, "Am I next?" The tragedy was that Henry's fear, meant to secure his throne, ultimately destabilized it. By killing those who had served him most faithfully, he hollowed out the nobility, weakening the very structure of England's politics. Bloodlines centuries old were snuffed out in a single paranoid decree. Families that had once buttressed the crown were erased, leaving gaps that would haunt the realm for decades. Thus, the later years of Henry VIII's reign were not only marked by physical decay, but by political decay as well. His body was falling apart. Yes, but so was the fabric of his kingdom. The Tower of London's stones were soaked not only in the blood of individuals, but in the lifeblood of England itself. Henry had become a king whose paranoia killed more effectively than any army, whose dreams ended more lives than any battlefield. In the silence after each execution, in the fearful glances exchanged across the court, one truth became clear. The king himself had become England's greatest enemy. By the mid-1540s, Henry VIII was no longer merely a tyrant in spirit, he was a ruin in flesh. His body had become an open battlefield where infection, obesity, and exhaustion clashed endlessly. He could scarcely walk, he could scarcely sleep. He lived imprisoned in his own enormity, carried about like a grotesque relic of what he had once been. The ulcers on his legs were now vast craters of rot, sometimes bursting without warning, soaking his clothes and carpets. His attendants wrapped them in layer upon layer of bandages that quickly turned black with pus and blood. The stench was so overwhelming that even physicians, hardened by years of treating plague victims, sometimes fled his chamber to vomit. Accounts tell us that the smell could be detected rooms away, worse than the open sewers of London. His face, once described as radiant and handsome, was swollen beyond recognition. His eyes were nearly buried beneath flesh. His breathing came in labored gasps, wheezing through a body collapsing under its own weight. His skin, stretched and shiny, seemed barely able to contain him. Even his own courtiers, those who had once competed for his favor, now dreaded his presence. To enter the king's chamber was to risk sickness, revulsion, and terror. Yet the greatest humiliation for Henry was not the smell, nor the swelling, nor the rotting. It was helplessness. The man who had once thundered into battlefields and danced at feasts now needed servants to carry him to his chair, to lift him into bed, to clean him when he could no longer control his bowels. He had executed men for showing insufficient respect, Yet he now relied on those same trembling attendants to tend to the most intimate degradations of his failing body. The irony was sharp, and those who witnessed it could not help but notice it. By his final weeks in January 1547, Henry's decline had become a spectacle of horror. His body was so grotesquely swollen that courtiers whispered he resembled something less than human. A bloated carcass more than a king. His temper, too, grew even more volatile. Pain and paranoia gnawed at him, and his court lived in constant dread. No one wanted to be near him, yet no one dared leave his side. The king who had claimed divine right, who had demanded absolute obedience, was reduced to a husk of corruption. He clung to his crown even as his body betrayed him, even as he was wheeled through his palaces leaving behind the stench of death. His reign of fear was ending, but it ended not in dignity, not in majesty, but in a slow collapse of flesh. On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII finally died, and yet, his death was not the end of horror. For even in death, his body continued the spectacle of grotesque corruption. What followed would be so disturbing, so unnatural, that it seemed almost as if his corpse itself refused to rest. Death should have closed the book on Henry VIII's reign of horror. But instead it wrote its most grotesque chapter. The king who had terrified his wives, his court, and his kingdom did not leave quietly. His corpse became as monstrous as his life. A final display of corruption that mocked the very dignity of kingship. At first, his attendants tried to control the spectacle. They wrapped his body in lead sheets, sealed him in multiple wooden coffins, and reinforced the casket with iron bindings. The hope was simple: contain the rot. But Henry's body, swollen with gases from unchecked decomposition, defied containment. As the funeral procession moved slowly from Whitehall to Windsor, rumors spread through the crowd. The king's coffin was groaning. Somewhere along the route, the pressure became too great. With a sudden rupture, the coffin split. The bloated body of Henry VIII burst open, spilling foul liquid and fragments of flesh across the hearse. The stench was unbearable. Servants scrambled with rags and buckets, scooping up what had been their sovereign. The dignity of a royal funeral dissolved into a grotesque cleanup operation. A horror that few could ever forget. And then came the dogs. Chroniclers record with grim fascination that street dogs licked the remains that had dripped from the coffin onto the road. The man who had demanded obedience, who had claimed to be God's chosen ruler, had become food for animals. It was a moment of brutal symbolism. A king who had consumed everything in life was now consumed in death. When the procession finally reached Windsor, more indignities awaited. The grave, dug hastily, was too narrow for the massive coffin. The ground collapsed beneath the weight, forcing laborers to widen the pit again and again. The burial that should have been solemn and majestic became clumsy, chaotic, almost farcical. Witnesses whispered that the earth itself seemed unwilling to receive him. And the horror did not end with burial. For months after, locals claimed a foul odor lingered around his tomb. Some swore they heard strange noises at night, groans, sighs, the restless movements of a man who could not find peace. Rumors spread that Henry's body was so corrupt that even the grave could not contain it. Priests muttered about divine punishment. Ordinary people spoke of curses. To many, it seemed fitting. Henry had lived a life of grotesque excess, of cruelty, paranoia, and rot. His death was no different. His coffin exploding in the open air became the perfect metaphor for a reign too corrupt to be sealed away. It was as if his body itself declared what history would eventually remember: that here lay not a noble monarch, but a man consumed by his own monstrous appetites. Thus ended the spectacle of Henry VIII. A king who had once inspired awe ended as a cautionary tale. His body bursting like a grotesque symbol of all he had inflicted upon others. Even in death, he left his kingdom not with peace, but with the stench of corruption. Henry VIII was gone, but the shadow he cast did not fade with his last breath. His body may have exploded into grotesque fragments, but his reign left deeper scars, psychological, political, and spiritual, that endured for generations. For his children, the damage was personal and devastating. Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, had grown up watching her mother's humiliation, seeing her stripped of her crown, banished from court, and cut off from her child. That trauma shaped Mary's reign. She became Bloody Mary, burning Protestants at the stake in a desperate attempt to undo her father's break from Rome and restore the faith that had defined her mother's life. It was as if the cruelty Henry had inflicted upon Catherine had passed like poison into Mary's veins. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, carried different scars. She was not yet 3 when her mother was executed at her father's command. Her entire childhood was a game of legitimacy. One day a princess, the next a bastard, depending on Henry's whims. She grew into a queen who never married, perhaps because she had seen too clearly what marriage to a king could mean. Her suspicion, her caution, her refusal to share power with a husband, all of it was shaped by the lessons of her father's cruelty. Even Edward, the long-awaited son of Jane Seymour, bore the weight of Henry's legacy. Sickly from birth, he inherited a throne nearly bankrupt, a kingdom divided by religious chaos. The Church of England, created not by devotion but by Henry's lust and ambition, became the battleground for decades of bloody conflict. Protestants and Catholics alike were executed in waves of vengeance, their blood staining England's soil because of one man's obsession with control. For the nobility, Henry's paranoia had been catastrophic. Whole families were extinguished, ancient bloodlines cut short by the swing of an axe. Loyalty offered no shield, suspicion was enough. The result was a hollowed-out aristocracy, leaving England unstable and vulnerable to power struggles for decades. Generations lived in the shadow of his executions, their alliances broken, their trust shattered. And then there was the economic wreckage. Henry's feasts, his wars, his endless building projects drained the treasury. The monasteries he dissolved, the wealthiest institutions in the kingdom, were stripped bare. Their riches poured into his coffers, only to be squandered on palaces, jewelry, and banquets. What he left behind was not stability, but debt, a kingdom staggering under the weight of its king's appetites. Perhaps the most insidious legacy, however, was psychological. Henry had turned England into a surveillance state, where trust itself was dangerous, where betrayal lurked in every household. That culture of suspicion did not die with him. It lingered in his children's reigns, in the politics of court, in the wary way Englishmen learned to hold their tongues. A nation had lived in terror of a single man's moods, and that fear became part of its fabric. And yet, history has often tried to soften him. Painters captured his youth, not his rot. Chroniclers celebrated his victories, not his cruelties. Plays, novels, films, even now, they sometimes portray him as a romantic figure, a larger-than-life king whose passions shaped an age. But peel back the myth, and the truth is undeniable. Henry VIII was not a hero. He was a monster in velvet and gold, a man whose crown gave him license to indulge every appetite and destroy anyone who displeased him. His story is not one of glory, but of warning. It shows us what happens when power is absolute, when no one dares speak truth to a ruler, when a man's desires outweigh the lives of thousands. Henry's very body became the symbol of that corruption, bloated, festering, collapsing under its own excess. Even his coffin could not contain him. So the next time you hear Henry VIII remembered for his 6 wives, or for a catchy rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, remember the horror behind the words. Remember the servants scrubbing pieces of their king's flesh from palace floors. Remember the wives who lived in terror, the courtiers executed on suspicion, the children twisted by trauma. Remember the coffin that burst, spilling corruption onto the road. This was Henry VIII, not a figure of romance, but a warning carved in flesh and blood. A king who ruled by fear, consumed by appetite, undone by his own corruption. His reign reminds us of the danger of unchecked power, and his legacy whispers through the centuries that monsters wear crowns too.